So today's speaker is Dr. Harvey Joanning. He's a psychologist and marriage family therapist, and he received his PhD in counseling and student personnel administration from the University of Iowa. He's a professor and the co-principal investigator of a neurobiology of relationship study at the University of South Alabama. He's also an emeritus professor and former director of the Marriage and Family Therapy doctoral program at Iowa State University. Today, he'll teach us about the neurobiology and treatment of relationships, and he'll examine how we fall in love, stay in love, parent children, lose love, and the neurobiological processes that influence intimate behavior. So I'll hand it over to him. And he said, as he goes, feel free to unmute and ask questions along the way so that we can keep it engaging. But if you want to put your question in the chat, that's always open too.
Well, good morning, everybody. I'm visiting with you from Jackson, Mississippi this morning. I'm doing some consulting work at the Baptist Hospital here and a college right across the street. So I'm not home in Fairhope like I usually am. So what I'd like to do this morning is invite you to interact with me, and I believe you have the ability to turn your mics on at will. So please do. If anything comes up you'd like to chat with me about, just jump on in. I'd rather have a dialogue rather than just me doing all the talking. And I'll stick around as long as I can today. I can stay until at least 11 o'clock Central Time, maybe a little bit beyond that, and interact with you. So what I'd like to do is give you a quick overview of what I've been up to for the last 52 years, which has been to study close human relationships, especially marriages and families. And as your introduction said, I am dual licensed as a psychologist and a marriage and family therapist. And I have a pretty broad background in training in counseling psychology, specifically the working with people during the lifespan through normal developmental changes. But I also have specialization in marriage and family therapy and neurophysiology and neuropsychology, which will become apparent as we go along. So what I'd like to do is just give you a quick overture today of what I'm into. There's much detail, and you should have received a paper called the Neurobiology and Treatment of Relationships. If not, perhaps our host can send that out to you, because I had forwarded that. And if you want to interact with me at any time, here is my contact information. Joanning@iastate.edu is the easiest way to get a hold of me. But we're going to talk a little bit about the brain and love today, and every pun intended, I'm going to marry psychology, the symbol to the left, with neuroscience. These are my parents. I grew up on a farm in Iowa, and my parents had a very, very loving relationship. I never heard a cross word between them. They got along incredibly well. In the neighboring farm, a mile away, my grandparents lived, and they lived together for 67 years until my grandpa died. And they were like the hens on the farmyard. They kept pecking at each other, but they never drew blood. So my parents had a very loving relationship. My grandparents stayed together, but they fought all the time, not violently. They just were always pecking at each other, just grumpy with each other. And I got fascinated by this difference, and I've spent my professional career comparing happy marriages with unhappy marriages, those marriages that are unhappy but stay together. I call them conflict-habituated relationships. And they're very, very heavily represented in a marriage counseling population. So let me give you just a quick overview of some components of how the brain works. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail. Again, you can read my paper. It goes into much more detail. But what I want to allude to are the brain areas of love, those areas of the brain and central nervous system that push us to be in a love relationship. And you'll see that I very carefully used the words brain areas, not brain parts. The old anatomists in the 1880s could break the human brain into three pieces as they were trying to do an autopsy. So they thought that these were the major parts of the brain. That's wrong. The brain doesn't have parts. It has areas of concentration. So let me give you an analogy. If you've been to a symphony orchestra, you know that the orchestra, when it's playing an ensemble, all areas of the orchestra are usually doing something all the time. The brain works very much that way. If you're looking at something very carefully in the distance, the back part of your brain is taking the lead in helping you perceive something that you're seeing, but all the rest of the brain is also involved. So in a symphony, at times the string section will take the lead. At times the brass section will take the lead. At other times the percussion section will take the lead, but the whole orchestra is still playing. That's very much how the brain works. If there's a conductor in the orchestra, it's in the prefrontal cortex. That's the area of the brain just above your nose and behind your forehead that is in charge of organizing activities, especially while you're conscious. When you're asleep, that part of the brain is asleep, so it's not doing very much. So at any rate, keep in mind that all areas of the brain are constantly functioning to one degree or another, but different areas of the brain might be more in charge at any given moment, depending on what it is your body's trying to accomplish. So this is a picture of the human brain from our brain lab at the University of South Alabama Medical School. I've spent a lot of time there. Our brain is made up of neurons, which you know very well. And your brain is a tremendous blood hog. These are simply the blood vessels in your head. Everything else has been removed. There are about 128 billion nerve cells. 80% of the cells in your brain, though, are not neurons. Most people think that your brain's filled with neurons. It's not. It's about 20% neurons. The rest are glial cells, from the Greek word for to glue. We used to think that these glial cells just held the neurons together. We know now that they are not only supportive cells, they do a lot of the thinking and a lot of processing of information along with neurons. Every neuron in your brain has several thousand connections with other neurons. That's 500 trillion connections total. That's why your brain is such a good computing device. The primary purpose of our brain is allostasis, from the Greek for all balanced. Within your brain, you have within your body, you have many different homeostatic systems. Some systems keep your breathing at a particular rate. Others keep your heart beating at a particular rate. Others keep your body at a constant temperature. When you lump all those homeostatic systems together, you get what's called allostasis, all balanced. Think about the last time your body was totally all balanced. You probably can't remember it, because rarely do we experience allostasis. There's always some subsystem that's out of whack. So we get hungry because we don't have enough food. We get thirsty because we don't have enough water. We get lonely because we don't have a partner. So rarely is everything in perfect balance. So maybe you're sitting on a mountaintop looking at the world around you and everything feels perfect. That doesn't happen very often. So our brain is trying to keep our body in balance at all times. It's trying to keep us alive long enough so we can reproduce. Okay, I'm done. That's all I have to say about it. I'm just kidding. That's really all the brain does. Your brain tries to keep you alive long enough so you can reproduce. That's it. You think, wow, there's a lot. The rest is window dressing, folks. I hate to tell you, but at a basic physiological level, that's what our brain is designed to do. And again, I've already talked about this. I'm going to skip over this. If you were a neuroscientist, I'd spend more time. This is the basic structure of a nerve cell anywhere in your body. It has a soma, a cell body with all those little branchy things coming in called dendrites. Those dendrites receive information from other neurons and from glands in your bodies, muscles in your body, things that these neurons might be connected to. The cell body takes in information through these little dendrites and sums them up. There are two kinds of information that can come in: excitatory and inhibitory. If more of the signals coming in are excitatory, usually 55 to 60% of them, if there's more excitatory than inhibitory signals coming in, eventually the cell body will say, oh, I better get excited now. There's something going on that I need to react to. So if there's enough excitation of a neuron, the little axon hillock there that you can see in this image opens up. It's like a floodgate. It allows a signal to be sent from the cell body down this long axon to the axon terminals, or the terminal buds at the other end of the neuron. So a signal is sent down the axon only when the cell body is sufficiently excited. If most of the signals coming in are inhibitory, that neuron stays calm and at rest. But if something excitatory is happening, a lion jumps up on the savannah, and it's starting to chase you, a whole lot of neurons are going to get really, really excited because you're going to be flooded with excitatory input. And so you're going to have a lot of axon hillocks opening up and a lot of signals being run down the axon. You'll see along the axon these I guess there's, I don't know what color that is exactly, but they're wrapped around the axon. Those are oligodendrocytes in the brain and Schwann cells in the rest of your body. They're fatty tissue that wraps around your brain as you mature from birth through about age 35. Those slowly wrap around long axons in your brain and the rest of your body. And as they wrap around, they myelinate the axon, which allows the axon to fire more frequently and to send a signal down the axon much more rapidly. So because the signals can be sent much more rapidly, the axon can fire more times a second. So when you are a 5-year-old, you think rather slowly, but through adolescence, you start to think faster. And by the time you're 25, 30, you're thinking much, much faster, many, many times faster than when you were younger. Okay. This is a picture of where one of these terminal buds connects with one of those little dendrites. So this is between two neurons. You have an axon going down to a terminal bud, which is the top part of this image, connecting with a postsynaptic dendrite. And inside that terminal bud, there's a lot of stuff going on. You'll see these little vesicles in purple there. They're filled with neural messengers. You've heard of neurotransmitters. Neurotransmitter is one kind of neural messenger. And they're filled with these neural messengers. And if the cell body gets sufficiently excited, an impulse comes down the axon, hits that terminal bud, and that terminal bud's going to send appropriate synaptic vesicles to the membrane. At the end of the terminal bud, those vesicles will burst through that membrane and dump something into the synapse between one neuron and the next neuron. And a lot of activity goes on between two neurons. And people ask me, well, why aren't they directly connected? Well, if they were directly connected, you wouldn't have nearly the computing power. Having the soup of neural messengers between the two neurons gives the brain and central nervous system much more computing power. So I teach 3 doctoral courses on this stuff, and I just gave you a whole doctoral course here in about a minute. So obviously there's a lot more going on. This is an image blown up about 10,000 times of, in purple, an axon coming down to a terminal bud. You can see the synapse and then the dendrite of the next neuron. This is greatly blown up. Now, these brain areas of love, I'm going to allude to these different names as I go through here. So don't go crazy, because if you don't understand Latin, it's no big deal. I'll explain it to you briefly. This image, if you have a color printer, print it off. I've had 3 world-class neuroscientists help me develop this image. It's the best flat image we've been able to come up with. Usually, if you were at our lab, we'd put a headset on you, a gaming headset, and we'd walk you around inside a human brain. And then we'd have to hold you up because you go, whoa, what's happening? But at any rate, this is what it looks like on a flat surface from one side. This is a so-called sagittal view from one side of the brain. But I'll come back to this image. Now, what gets really confusing for people is neurotransmitters and hormones. What's the difference? Well, folks, there ain't no difference. It just depends on where the chemical is. If the chemical is in the synaptic gap, it's a neural messenger or a neurotransmitter of some kind. If it's in your bloodstream, it's a hormone. My students get really confused about this, and I have a friend who's a world-class endocrinologist, and he finally helped me understand exactly what the difference is. There isn't. It just depends on where the chemical is. So you've probably heard of things like serotonin, which is usually a neurotransmitter, but in the gut, it can be a hormone. It just depends on where it is. These are the primary neurotransmitters, which you've heard of, and I'm not going to go into any detail today. This is just a neat chart to have. The 2 most common neurotransmitters in the brain are glutamate and GABA. Glutamate excites the little cell body. GABA inhibits the cell body. It's the balance of 2 that is crucial. Other neurotransmitters can be excitatory or inhibitory, but these are the two most common ones. Then there are a bunch of hormones of love that I'm going to just allude to a little later as we go along. These hormones are generated from ductless endocrine glands throughout your body. But the most important ones in terms of love relationships are the pituitary gland, which is an extension of the hypothalamus, and the testicles and ovaries in men and in women, because they generate testosterone and estrogen. These other ductless glands have a minor role in the love relationship. The ones I just mentioned are the major ones of interest. This little slide shows you what these ductless glands are up to. This is what they take the lead in doing. But like the symphony orchestra, all these ductless glands work in harmony with one another, just like all areas of the brain work in harmony with one another. They're all doing something all the time. Okay, testosterone is something you've heard of. It motivates especially sexual behavior. And ladies, you have testosterone, so do men. Men have about 5 times more testosterone than you do, but women have about 5 times more estrogen than men. Testosterone is downstream from estrogen. That is, all men and women have estrogen in their body, but in men, most of the estrogen gets converted to testosterone. Without testosterone, you would have no sex drive at all. Estrogen, you ladies know it regulates a lot of things in your reproductive cycle. I'm not going to go into any detail. You've probably heard of oxytocin, the so-called cuddle hormone. I'll come back to that. It surges during orgasm and breastfeeding, but it's a hormone that pushes pair bonding species to bond. Some birds are just flooded with this stuff. Human beings are moderately pair bonding species. For the most part, we pair bond, so we have a fair amount of oxytocin floating around in our system when we're in love. Endorphins, you've probably heard of. They reduce pain. They give you a feeling of pleasure. I am a long distance runner. This morning, I got up and ran 4 miles. I run for the 3rd and 4th mile because I'm getting flooded with endorphins, and it feels really, really good, the so-called run high. I'll come back to this. Dopamine, you've heard of. This is another pleasure hormone. Endorphins act very, very quickly over a short period of time, 20, 30 seconds, a minute, whereas dopamine lasts a lot longer. They both do the same basic thing, but dopamine stays in your system a lot longer. You need dopamine. Without dopamine, you're not going to fall in love with anybody. Serotonin is a mood hormone that you're familiar with. Too little of it, you're just feeling lower than an alligator's body. Too much of it, and you cannot be sexually aroused. So as serotonin reuptake inhibitors, which are commonly used to treat depression, also tend to shut down people's sex drive, so they don't like that very much. And this gives you an idea of where dopamine and serotonin do its work. Dopamine primarily is working between the middle of the brain and the front of the brain. Serotonin floods the whole brain. And this will become important when we talk about how you fall in love. This gives you a little bit of an idea of what area of the brain is taking the lead when you're thinking, for example, or when you're trying to see something. The back of the brain, the occipital lobe in the back of your brain is taking the lead when you're trying to see something. I'm going to be alluding to the work of Jack Panksepp, and I did not misspell his name. He is dead now, but he died 3 years ago. Jack is from Armenia, and so they spell Jack a little differently there. He was the first neuroscientist to really study emotions. Neuroscientists didn't study emotions until Jack came along because they didn't know how to do it, and Jack figured out how to do it. And Jack and his team have developed this very important framework for how human emotions work. Now, when I say the word emotion, I'm speaking as a hardcore neuroscientist. I'm not speaking of emotions the way they are usually talked about. Usually when people are talking about emotions, they're talking about feelings. We neuroscientists talk about primal emotions deep in our viscera. Our body is constantly reacting to the environment around us. And our body then generates nerve impulses and hormones that get sent up to the brain. And let me jump to my next slide, a couple of slides down here. Here we go. So you have all these neurotransmitters and, all these hormones and neural impulses coming up from your body, and they are first processed in what I call the basement of the brain. Hopefully you can see my image. Pretend my arm is your backbone. At the top of your backbone is a bulb, the pons, that's filled with all kinds of important ganglia. And the part of the pons is the para-aqueductal gray, or the PAG for short. It summarizes all of those hormones, all of those neural impulses coming into your brain, and has first cut at them. Your sense of sight, smell, hearing, and touch also are all being fed into the PAG. And what it does is puts that all together to generate one or more primal emotions. And I have those primal emotions listed for you. They're under primary: seeking, lust, care, and so on. The most ancient primal emotion is seeking. We think it evolved 583 million years ago, after the last time the globe stopped being a gigantic ice ball. The globe has been a huge ice ball many, many times in the past, but 583 million years ago, it started to thaw out. And the only thing alive were small 1 or 2 cell creatures in warm areas, usually around volcanic vents near the equator. That's the only place life could exist. Well, those little guys started bumping into each other and started to coalesce, and eventually had to start coordinating with one another. So a very primitive nervous system started. And the first part of the nervous system to evolve, we think, was the seeking expectancy system. It helped these organisms seek the right temperature and nutrients. Out of that basic system grew the sense of curiosity. Organisms would seek out something that they thought would help their body stay in allostasis, stay in balance. And so they would move towards the volcanic vent, they'd move towards nutrients, they'd move towards the right temperature in order to stay alive. So we think that was the first emotion to evolve. And interestingly, that seeking expectancy system is the only area of the brain that is directly connected to an outside sense organ, your sense of smell. So we think the first sense was smell, which was connected with seeking, so that these organisms could find the right place to get some nourishment. And then over the next 100 million years or so, the other 6 primal emotional systems slowly evolved, and I'm going to be alluding to them as I go along. The important thing to keep in mind is you have 7 primal emotions that are outside of your conscious awareness, deep in your brain. As those primal emotions get activated, the PAG passes information into the middle part of your brain. Let me see if that's, okay. So the PAG, you can see it there at the bottom of your brain. It takes the information, generates one or more primal emotions, and then passes that emotion on to the purple area of the brain, the limbic system, from the Greek to limit. Limbic means to limit. So the limbic system takes their raw emotions, and then it compares the information coming in from the PAG with what's happening around you at any point in time. Something's happening in your environment. So the limbic system takes that primal emotion and converts it into a feeling. A feeling is an interpretation of the emotion based on what's happening to you right now. So let me give you an example. Are any of you idiots, are any of you crazy enough to be skydivers? Probably not. I think it's an insane thing to do, but some people love skydiving. So if you're going to become a skydiver, you're going to take months of training. They very carefully train you how to jump out of an airplane, open a parachute, and not kill yourself in the process. So if you become a skydiver, let me go down to my little image here. Okay, here we go. I'm almost there. So if you become a skydiver, you get into that airplane the first time for a real jump, and you get to the edge of the airplane just before you're going to jump out. You're usually tethered to another person who's going to help you. And the circuit that's going to be up and running, in addition to the seeking circuit is always running. If it's not running, you're dead. because these other 6 circuits all grew out of it and are dependent on it. But if you get to the edge of the airplane and you're ready to jump out, the primal emotion you're going to be experiencing is fear and or panic, but probably fear. But as you jump out of the airplane, the feeling that you're going to have is exhilaration because you've prepared to do this. Let's say that you really made the mafia mad at you and they kidnapped you and they took you to an airplane and they threw you out of the airplane. When you got to the edge of the airplane, your primal emotion would be fear. But as you fell out of the airplane, your feeling would be terror because you're totally unprepared for it. So the same primal emotion can generate a whole host of different feelings depending upon what's going on in your environment at any given point in time. Now, to come up with the proper interpretation, the limbic system in the middle of your brain talks to the neocortex, the wrinkly part of the brain on the outside of your brain, and that's where memories and instincts are stored. So the limbic system says, okay, PAG, what are the emotions I'm feeling right now? Okay, neocortex, do we remember anything like this? Have we experienced this before? Oh, we have. Oh, yeah, this is no big deal. We're familiar with it, no problem. We haven't experienced this before, or we've experienced it before and it was a really bad scene. Oh, this isn't good. We need to protect ourselves. So what's happening is the whole brain is talking within itself to come up with the proper feeling or interpretation of emotions and the proper thoughts about what to tell yourself at any point in time. Now, if you're a practicing psychotherapist, part of your job is to help people unpack the feelings and thoughts that they're having at any given time, because primal emotions can't be fake. They just happen. But our interpretation of primal emotions can vary all over the place, depending on the theories that we tell ourselves, which we remember because of our history as an organism. So if we've grown up in a very loving household, for example, and we've had a rich environment growing up and we've learned a lot of things, we have a lot more resources in memory to bring to bear to help the limbic system come up with an appropriate, useful interpretation. The key thing is the interpretation must be useful to help us survive and reproduce. That's what the brain's trying to accomplish. If you had a very limited childhood and you were resource poor, you didn't have many experiences, you don't have nearly as much information stored in your memory to help you make an appropriate interpretation at any given time. Well, why am I going on about this? In couples therapy and in family therapy, you're going to run full bore into the person's ability or inability to make proper interpretations given what's happening in the environment right now. And I can tell you, based on our lab research over the last 20 years at USA, that people who don't have a good ability to interpret what's happening to themselves and come up with an appropriate plan of action, they struggle a lot more than those of us who've had a really rich experience growing up. So I just summarized another doctoral course in a couple of minutes. So I'm moving real quickly so we can get to a discussion of this. What I wanted to do is give you this real basic background of how the brain works and how it drives behavior. Okay, so I'm going to skip over a bunch of this stuff because we just don't have time. This is our brain lab, by the way. This is one of my graduate students checking out the equipment to make sure it's worked. If any of you have seen the old Star Trek series, Star Trek Next Generations, with the cyborgs, or with the Borg rather, that's what our clientele look like. We have them hooked up to all this apparatus because we're reading everything that's going on in their body and brain as they're dealing with one another. I don't know of any other lab in the United States that's set up to do that. So we're doing some, I think, pioneering work. But then to summarize, our brain's primary process is developing raw emotions. The secondary processing of those emotions into feelings occurs in the limbic system. And then we develop thoughts based on those emotions and feelings. It's an interactive process. Okay. Here's a couple of my students goofing off. We have been studying happy couples and unhappy couples, and we're comparing the two. And they look very different, folks, on brain scans, for example. Happy couples have a particular pattern of behavior, a pattern in their brain that's very predictable. Unhappy couples have a very different a range of patterns of behavior. And when Jack and I first started looking at this years ago, I said, Jack, there's something about these unhappy couples' brain pattern that looks familiar to me. And then I realized for years I worked for the National Institute on Drug Abuse. They look like drug addicts. So I think what's happening is these people who stay together but fight all the time are addicted to the fighting. They fight, which floods them with stress hormones, and then they go to their separate corners and rest for a while, and then they make up. But when they make up, you see this rush of endorphins and dopamines, which is very, very pleasurable. So we think that's what's going on with these not so happy couples who stay together, but we haven't proven that for sure. Hey, I'm going to shut up and see if there's any comments or questions so far.
Doctor, I have a question.
Sure.
When you have the not so happy couple and you're looking at their brain scans, if one person feels that they're happy in the relationship, but the other person doesn't, do you see differences in those scans?
By definition, these conflict habituated couples are both unhappy. Now, we do have couples who are a mix. One person is happy, the other is not, and their brain patterns look different. So if we're talking, though, about conflict habituated couples, both of them are unhappy to the point of being miserable, but they stay together anyway. Thank you for the question.
Thank you.
I'm curious what, when you say their brain patterns look different, like, could you briefly describe, like, what is it that you're looking at? What are those brain patterns?
Happy couples, we see a lot of activity in, let me go back to my little diagram, because you asked a great question. Okay. When a couple is happy and they're interacting, we see the seeking circuit up and running, obviously, because otherwise they'd be dead. But we also see the care circuit and the play circuit and sometimes the lust circuit running. But we definitely see the care circuit running, because that is, if that care circuit isn't running, the couple really isn't in love. A true love comes when that care circuit is up and running all the time, because you're caring for someone that you're concerned about because they're so important to you. They have become an integral part of your environment that helps you maintain homeostasis. Now, couples who stay together and fight a lot, sometimes their seeking and care circuits are up, but sometimes their seeking and fear or seeking and rage circuits are up and running, and you don't see their play circuit running nearly as much. The play circuit is necessary to help mammals learn how to socialize with one another. So if you watch puppies or kittens, they're wrestling and playing with each other, learning how to interact with each other. As couples are first moving into a relationship, their seeking circuit is up and running because they're seeking a partner, but their lust circuit and their play circuit come online very quickly. And then a bit later, the care circuit comes online. So among our happy couples, those are the circuits we see running, and we rarely see rage, fear, or panic. Among the conflict habituated couples, we see an interplay of rage, fear, and panic all the time. So there's very different patterns of activity in the brain. Hopefully I've kind of answered your question. Okay.
Yes, thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, I'm going to jump way ahead here now and talk about falling in love. What happens when two people start to fall in love? I love this slide. I don't know if you can see it clearly on your end, but the brain or the heart wants to do what it wants to do, and the brain says, hey, well, wait a minute, are you sure you want to get us into this? Our brain is pretty conservative in the sense that it's trying to keep us alive, and getting into a love relationship is very risky because it takes a lot of energy, and the brain does not like to expend energy unless it's getting a lot in return. So, okay, so let's talk a little bit about the physiology of love. Most of what's happening, or so much of what's happening, is unconscious. It's at a physiological level. It's driving our behavior, but we're not aware of it. We can't help but want to fall in love if we're a human being, unless you're one of those 1% or so that can generate their own oxytocin without a partner. And those people we think tend to be on the autistic spectrum. But 99% of us, we are driven to have a mate because we are pack animals. Human beings don't do well on their own in general. So we have these brain circuits and hormonal processes that are always shaping our feelings, thoughts, and behavior and driving us to behave in a particular way. And we just think we're in charge. Folks, I'm telling you, I've given up on the idea of free will. We can make decisions in the moment about something specific, but our body is driving us to behave in a particular way. You get up in the morning, you go to the potty, you look for some food, you look for something to drink, you look for companionship, and you do that without thinking about it because your brain is pushing you to do that, even if you're only half conscious. Okay, let's see. I'm also going to allude to Helen Fisher's work, which will become obvious as we go along. She has described 3 initial stages of love: lust, attraction, and attachment, which I'll go over very quickly. The first stage of love is lust. Again, your brain is designed to keep you alive long enough so you can reproduce. So the first circuit that's going to come online, in addition to seeking, is lust. We have couples up into their 80s who we have studied. Couples who've been together 40 years or longer, and couples who are dating, who are just getting together in their 70s and 80s. And even these people in their 70s and 80s, way beyond the ability to reproduce, their lust circuit is up and running clearly along with seeking when they first get together. And this seeking circuit, the seeking expectancy circuit, is the most ancient. And it goes from the top of the brainstem all the way up to the prefrontal cortex just behind your forehead. And it's a very, very complex system of brain areas that work in combination with one another. The other 6 primal circuits grow out of this basic system. That's why I've given you this diagram. Now, some of these, you may have heard of the hippocampus because it's very involved in forming new memories and remembering things from the past. It's also involved in keeping you spatially oriented so that you know where you are. And you've probably heard of the amygdala, and people think, well, the amygdala is the cause of fear. No. The amygdala is part of the fear anxiety circuit, but it's just part of the circuit. It takes more of a leadership role, but it's part of that circuit as well as part of the seeking circuit. So these different areas of the seeking expectancy system I will allude to as I go along. Okay. Oh, I have a visual effects team. These are students who, they help me develop this stuff. I teach them brain science and they come up with these neat images. This is a seeking expectancy circuit. We've made this cartoon to show you it operating. This is a combination of neural messengers floating around in this complex system. So I wanted you to have some idea of just how pervasive the seeking system is. It's by far the largest primal brain circuit. And here again, if you go from this image to this image, you can kind of see what's happening. Okay, now, and so lust comes up first. And when we're looking for a mate, what's interesting is we tend to be on our best behavior because we have to beat the competition. We engage in courting behavior, but our courting behavior varies from culture to culture. I have studied love relationships in 27 different countries all over the world. I've spent 45 years now traveling all over the world, studying different cultures, and there are some things that are common in courting, but there are certainly cultural differences. So, for example, when we look at flirting, so I'm going to jump back and forth. I've studied baboons in Kenya. Baboons flirt the same way that humans do. So do bonobos and chimpanzees. Bonobos are our closest cousins in the animal kingdom. But bonobos, and chimpanzees are very closely related to us, and they court in the same way we do. We flirt in a particular sequence. The females smile, lift their eyebrows, raise their shoulders, arch their back, and toss their hair. I've seen these guys doing it. That's a female there in the image further away is a female, and she was engaging in that kind of behavior, and then the male started approaching her. You'll see this behavior in bars. You'll see at cocktail parties, you'll see women doing this. They're not even consciously aware that they're doing it. We've taken videos, and sure enough, they're doing it Men, on the other hand, males walk up to her, arch their back, and thrust their upper body in her direction. Fisher has done studies of this. Sapolsky has done it among mammals throughout Africa. It's a common sequence among primates. Primates are our closest cousins in the animal kingdom. So what I'm trying to get at is these kinds of courting behaviors are common among any mammal that walks on hind legs, especially, or is a primate. As we get involved in these courting behaviors, we get a rush of dopamine from our nucleus accumbens, which is part of that seeking expectancy system. And that dopamine makes us feel really, really good. It's a pleasurable hormone. And we're also getting endorphins at the same time. Endorphins and dopamine in combination give us a tremendous sense of pleasure while we're seeking a potential mate. And as long as we're having fun with that person and playing with them and having a good time, we get flooded with dopamine and endorphins, which keeps that behavior going. So what happens is the old limbic system is helping us stay in the mood to stay with another person. I'm just going to mention the amygdala quickly in passing. It is heavily involved in making sure that the person that we're spending time with is safe to be around. Love does not emerge in the presence of fear. If the fear response is up and running, forget it. You're not going to be able to build a bonded relationship with that person. The amygdala is constantly monitoring for ambiguity in your environment. So if everything in your environment is familiar and there's nothing to worry about in the environment, the amygdala stays very calm. But if something unusual happens, something that the amygdala doesn't recognize initially, it starts talking to the wrinkly part of your brain and says, do you remember anything like this? No, I've never seen this before. Or I've seen it before and it really ended badly. Then the amygdala starts getting the fight, flight, freeze, our fear responses up and running so that we protect ourselves and get away from danger. So we did a study several years ago. We had our graduate students go out to parties for singles. And when people walk into these singles parties, within 30 seconds, they scan the whole room and then they focus on one or two people and they move towards them. That is your seeking expectancy system sorting through who is in that room. And in the seeking expectancy system is an area called the nucleus accumbens, and its job is to help you sort very, very quickly among everybody in the room to choose which person to approach. And the amygdala and the nucleus accumbens work together to make sure that as you walk towards that person, they look safe. You start to talk to them, and if they are nice to you and they're pleasant, your amygdala says, okay, we'll stay with this person. If they do something that we don't like or that we are find a little jicky, immediately our amygdala says, whoa, and the amygdala and nucleus accumbens move you away from that person. And that happens within a fraction of a second. Our brain is very, very fast. It takes our brain 30 thousandths of a second to make decisions about whether something is safe or not. Somebody runs the stop sign in front of you when you're driving down the street, your foot's on the brake before you can even think about it. Otherwise, you'd be dead. So it only takes your body 30 thousandths of a second to react to that person running the stop sign. It takes you up to a full second to think about what is going on. And a second is an eternity in terms of brain function. All right, let's see. Okay, we're gonna get down to, go ahead.
I was wondering, for people who grew up in, adverse contexts and families, do their amygdala...
Say again, I didn't quite understand what you said.
Oh, talking about people who grew up with, adversity and all forms of abuse, like would their amygdala not fire, or because they're used to, or, where the adversity becomes familiar, or does the amygdala still fire when there's something there?
The amygdala is likely to come online and fire much more readily if you've grown up in a traumatic situation. The back half of the amygdala becomes enlarged in people who've been through a lot of trauma. I work a lot with veterans who've been through a lot of war scenes, a lot of really harsh battles. Their amygdalas are quite enlarged. The posterior back portion of it is very enlarged. So they're hypersensitive to anything in the environment that might be dangerous. If you grew up in a dangerous household, you're going to be hypersensitive to anything that might lead to danger for you. thank you for asking, because that's very important.
So I guess, sorry, follow-up question is then, how come do people often, fall back in same patterns later on in their romantic relationships?
That's habituation. Our brain likes predictability. And our brain will push us to do the same thing over and over again, even if we're doing something that's gotten us in trouble before, because it's familiar. We can predict what's going to happen. So part of being a therapist working with those folks is to slow them down and say, hey, the last 17 times you've done this, you've gotten yourself in a world of hurt. Let's imagine other scenarios that you might engage in that would give you a better result. Your brain is a master at imagining things. We imagine different scenarios every moment of the day. So as you're falling in love, if you're going out to a party and for singles and you're meeting people, your brain is very quickly running scenarios, imaginary simulations of what might happen if I do and say this, as opposed to this and this and this. Then we choose one course of action and we try it to see how it works. And if it works well, we continue that course of action. But if it doesn't work well, we immediately go to another simulation and try something else. And that's all happening below our conscious awareness. But we can measure those simulations in the lab. People can have a dozen simulations going at the same time, and then they within a fraction of a second choose one and act on it, because you don't have but a fraction of a second to react typically. This is very complex stuff at a neurophysiological level. And the reason I got into this kind of research is I figured out 40 years ago that simple talk therapy ain't going to get you there, especially with tough cases. If you don't understand the neurophysiology and the biology underpinning people's behavior, you're going to get stuck. So during my career, my colleagues, first at Texas Tech University and then at Iowa State and now at the University of South Alabama, they dump all their problem couples on me. You go see Johnny, he likes to deal with, they just give up. They don't know what the hell to do with them. So they come to me and we put them in the lab and we start figuring out what's going on at a physiological level. So very slowly over the last 30 years, we figured out what to do with these really tough conflict habituated couples. And part of it is we teach them about brain science and we slow them down because they tend to interact very, very quickly. And they can go from fairly calm to a juggernaut fight within a couple, 3 seconds. So we've got to slow them down. And we have, I don't have time today, but I have a video of me working with a couple and I show how to do that, to slow them down so that they can talk and interact without getting into a fight. And that is tough. Unless you know how to do that, you can't work with conflict habituated couples. So I do a lot of, I go around the country training people how to work with these tougher couples. But again, this is just an overture today. I'll give you an idea of what I'm up to. By the way, I guess you folks are spread all over the United States, though, are you not? Okay. I was going to say, I live in South Alabama now since I've been retired, but I spent a lot of time in Iowa and Illinois and Minnesota because that's where my kids are. So this summer we will leave Southern Illinois, May 22nd. We're going to Bloomington, Illinois to visit my daughter and my grandchildren for a few days. And then we're going to Iowa to visit my son and my relatives in Iowa. And then we're going up to Minneapolis to visit my daughter who has advanced Alzheimer's disease, by the way. Some of you folks are probably aware I'm an expert on Alzheimer's disease, especially early onset, because my first wife succumbed to early onset Alzheimer's disease at age 47. And she was number 17 in her family that we knew of at the time. She had a defective gene that has just riddled her family. And one of my 3 children has that gene. So at age 50, she's approaching, she won't be with us very much longer. So if you're interested in Alzheimer's disease, that's another thing I do a lot of training around. Okay. I want to move very quickly. I don't have time to go through all this, but I want to give you an idea of what happens as we fall in love. This is, I want to bring hormones into the situation. Men and women respond at a deep physiological level to the physical appearance of a member of the opposite sex. Men respond to the hourglass figure. We can't help it. Our brain is designed to respond to this particular waist to hip ratio, and we can't help it. As soon as we see a woman with an hourglass figure, our body says, oh, she's fertile, let's mate with her. And that happens before we even have a chance to think about it. You ladies, when you see a confident man with a lot of resources, your body's going to respond because you need a partner with resources to help you keep your kids alive. And that all happens at a subconscious level. And we can measure it in the lab. And what ladies, men and women say, oh, no, I don't respond that way. We put them in the lab, and sure enough, their brain, central nervous system, their endocrine system respond this way, even though they think they're in, that
Harvey,
it won't.
I'm
Yes.
sorry to interrupt, but
Sure.
somebody already asked about this.
Okay.
For the LGBTQ people,
Community.
do they have the same non-conscious responses that you're describing?
They have non-conscious responses, but in a little bit different way. A male homosexual will have a similar, will have this response, but to the male body. And lesbian women will have the same response that a man might have to a woman's body that has this hourglass figure. At least that's what we think. Now, we've worked mostly with heterosexual couples. We are working with some same-sex couples, but our N is too small to make a real definitive judgment about. But what we think is happening is there's a bit of a switch in what the brain of a gay man or a lesbian woman will respond to.
I think that's helpful, especially in a society that still makes all kinds of demeaning accusations about people in this community, as opposed to what you just described, which is—
Well, so I'm not one of those people.
I know you aren't.
Well, I've spent time in Washington State watching otters. Otters are incredibly homosexual. And if you studied bonobos in Africa, they're having sex with each other all the time. Males with males, males with females, females with females, little young ones with older ones. They're constantly having sex. They have a completely different sexual system than we humans have. So a lot of this is just driven by biology. So a certain percentage of every species is same-sex oriented. In humans, depending on the research you look into, is somewhere between 4 and 8%, we think. That hasn't been definitively defined, but there is a certain percentage of human beings that are attracted to members of the same sex. And it's just, I think, a physiological predisposition. So it's normal. It's just part of the normal range of human behavior. Okay. If you've ever wondered why this beautiful young blonde woman is married to this 53-year-old guy who's fat and ugly, well, he has resources probably. And if I'm not supposed to bring politics into this, but just think of a certain politician who's been in office who has this rather attractive wife. Well, I won't go any further. You get the message, though. Our physiology pushes us to do things that an outsider might look at and say, well, why is she doing that? Or why is he doing that? Trying to shut down sexuality in an adolescent, forget it. It's not going to happen. All you can do is channel the sexuality in a proper direction. So I do a lot of consulting with different church groups, and I get in trouble all the time because they'll ask me about non-controversial issues like abortion. And I'll say, well, if you want to get rid of abortion, you better start sex education at age 4, and you better give them birth control and plenty of health care, because if you do that, you're not going to have a problem with abortion. All you have to do is look at Holland, Norway, and Sweden. Their abortion rate is almost nil because they start appropriate sex education at age 4, and they combine it with relational education so that these kids know what the heck they're getting into. And as they get older, they teach them more and more about how reproduction works, and they make sure they get adequate health care. They give them free birth control, and they make sure that they're monitored by sane adults. So anyway, I've been hauled before state legislators all the time to talk about this sort of stuff, and they don't like my response because they want me to give them some simplistic answer that agrees with them, and I won't do that because I know how the brain works. Okay. Again, I don't want to get into too much detail here because we'll run out of time. We start in the lust stage of love within the first couple of months, And then we move towards attraction. So at first, our bodies want to reproduce with this person, but we get to know them a bit. And then we decide, well, maybe I don't want to spend much time with this person. I move away. Or, gee, I really find her, I really find him interesting. I like them. And we become attracted to them, and we'll spend anywhere up to 2 years spending a lot of time with them. It takes 18 months to 2 years for a true love relationship to really develop. So we go through this attraction stage where we're really trying each other on for size to see if we want to stay in that relationship. As we're going into attraction, our oxytocin levels come way up. This bonding hormone increases. Vasopressin increases. Vasopressin is a catalytic hormone that, when added to any other hormone, makes its effect much more intense. So you start with raw oxytocin. Pretty soon you add vasopressin to it, and boy, you're pair bonding at that point. And we do this because we need to fall in love because our children need us. Remember, our brain is designed to keep us alive long enough so we can reproduce. And our children can't take care of themselves for at least 4 to 8 years. So we need to stay with the kids for a while. That's why our brain is designed to have us bond with another person for the long term, so we can take care of our children long enough so they can survive. So that's what our brain is about, folks. I'm sorry, it's to keep us alive so we can reproduce and take care of our children. And during the initial lust and attraction stages, we have the play joy circuit up and running that helps us learn how to be in a relationship with another person. I've done studies for 40 years of couples who are in really good relationships. These are the things they have in common. This is based on 207 couples I've studied, and several hundred more that my colleagues have studied around the United States. So if these things are going on in a relationship, chances are it's going to last for a long time. But it takes a couple, at least 2 years, to even begin to have this level of knowledge of one another and to develop these kinds of behaviors with one another. You can't figure out who a good partner would be in a couple of days. It takes months, up to 2 years. So we go through these first 2 stages, and we eventually get to the attachment stage of love. And we know a couple's in the attachment stage because the care nurturing circuit is up and fully functioning. If it's not fully functioning, they're still either in lust or attraction. They haven't got to attachment. So I've very quickly taken you through the stages of love, and I'm looking at the watch here. I'm at 11 o'clock. So what I'd like to do is shut up. I simply don't have time to go any further, and I'd like to spend some time visiting with you about what I've talked about so far. And if you're interested, I can always come back and do more with you.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm going to stop the recording in a second. And I think we have some questions from earlier.
Sure.
I know Jody had a
Go for it.
question, and I'm seeing a few others in the chat, and Laura has her hand up. So let me
Okay.
stop this recording.